When Konami started making games for the Sega Genesis, I was filled with pride and excitement. My favorite platform had come a long way since its release in 1989, and I was ready for some of my favorite games to finally make an appearance on a Sega console. And show up in force they did. Whether it was arcade-inspired content or something new just for the home, Konami's output on the Genesis was nothing short of incredible. Castlevania, Contra, Tiny Toons, and more added must-own games to my collection. But in August of 1993, a completely new IP from Konami showed up and I didn't know quite what to make of it. It starred an opossum named Sparkster, and if you have ever dealt with one of these things in real life, you know they are vile creatures that typically dig into your garbage cans at nighttime, not cute and cuddly heroes that save the world. Despite the dubious nature of the character, it was Konami, and if I had learned anything about gaming at that point, you always gave the best the benefit of the doubt. In this episode, we will be taking a look at Rocket Knight Adventures, an exclusive action title for the Sega Genesis. Did it hold its own against the other big hitters from Konami, or was it a letdown you need not worry about? Let's find out. The story of Rocket Knight Adventures is pretty familiar to anyone who played games back then. Our hero Sparkster must save a princess, defend a kingdom under siege, and pull a Rambo by going in alone and beating everyone down all by his lonesome. There's a pig army to dispatch, a bunch of vehicles to wreck, and of course spikes in water levels for you to deal with. Despite all that, Rocket Knight here is rather easy to pick up and play. It uses just 2 action buttons in fact. There's your attack, which is a sword projectile that travels short distances, and a jump button. Sparkster does have additional moves depending on your situation. Holding your attack button charges your rocket pack, and letting it go allows you to do a blast attack in the direction that you are holding at the time. If you don't press a direction or hold down, Sparkster will rocket spin in place to hit enemies multiple times. The rocket blast also allows you to move around faster and bounce off walls in tighter areas. Sparkster also has a tail that allows him to grab onto things. Some stages are actually built around this mechanic entirely. Within each area there are apples and bananas that replenish life, and there are extra men strewn about to keep you in the fight longer. Most of your enemies are fairly easy to defeat. A swift sword slice and they're goners, but there are additional bad guys that use robot enhancements that need further beating to get rid of. Most of this takes place on the ground, but there are a few stages that resemble a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up as well. These break up the on-foot sections and add a bit of variety to the presentation. The director of this game was the guy behind many of the Contra titles at the time, so boss battles, stage hazards, and the overall design should feel right at home to longtime Konami fans. Rocket Knight Adventures is, in a single word, gorgeous when it comes to visuals. Bright, colorful landscapes adorn each and every stage, and there is no shortage of parallax scrolling, special effects like heat distortion and reflections, and massive multi-jointed sprites all over the place. In fact, it's one of Konami's better efforts on the hardware, especially when taken in as a whole. It also has a variety in its stages that's really impressive for an 8-megabit cartridge. It looks better than many games twice its size. Many of the cooler looking effects would be reused in some of Konami's later games as well. You will quickly recognize many similarities to stages, enemies, and effects used in Castlevania Bloodlines and Contra Hard Corps. Sometimes I'll take damage or get killed just looking at the backgrounds go by or appreciating the stellar sprite work. The color in particular is impressive. This looks like it's running 3 or 4 times the color you normally see in a Genesis game, and easily gives some of the better looking Super Nintendo games a run for their money. Sprite flicker and slowdown rarely mar the presentation despite the large sprites and screen filling bosses. There's just nothing negative to say here about the graphics. It's impressive from the moment you start playing, and stays that way to the moment you see the credits roll. The sound and music were done by a number of veterans for Konami. This talented bunch has worked on many well-known games over the years, and the end result of their collaboration lent a great sound to Rocket Knight Adventures. Aside from the solid sound effects, you also get some pretty nice music as well. Here are a few selections for you to enjoy. So, we have a good-looking, sounding, and playing game. What's the problem? Not a lot, fortunately. It has a quality indicative of Konami's output in the early to mid-90s. The stages are structured to be easy in the opening and gradually getting harder the longer you play. This leaves it open to both novice and veteran gamers alike. The 2-button interface couldn't be any easier to use, and there are plenty of wow moments with boss and graphical assets. The only real problem Rocket Knight has is in its variance of difficulty. On easy, you'll blast through 2/3 of this with no issues at all. Hell, some of you might even beat it your first or second setting. I have not played this seriously in years, and I made it all the way to stage 6, no issues at all, before needing my first continue. To put that into context, it only has 7 stages. That leads one to believe that putting it on normal will alleviate the rather moderate challenge, but things are pretty much the exact opposite. Normal gives you but a single continue, so a few ill-timed mistakes can end your entire run deep in the game. The hard setting takes things even further by giving you a single life and 0 continues, which basically means you will need to play this many times to even think about seeing the ending there. This turns Rocket Knight into somewhat of a difficult game that will really press many of you to the breaking point on anything above easy. So it really breaks down to this. Easy is a bit too easy, normal starts really punishing you in the late game, and hard is way too damn difficult. Worse, the best ending is reserved for hard only, a scene many of you will never be able to appreciate. The Japanese version is much more forgiving, however. Its normal mode gives you 5 continues, and hard gives you 3, a damn sight more realistic than the US version. And speaking of the Japanese Mega Drive edition, it's fully playable to English-speaking audiences, and there are some differences between it and the Western versions. The opening cinematic is completely changed, and the stage introductions are as well. It's definitely the way to go if you want a challenge that won't have you pulling your hair out. Overall, Rocket Knight Adventures manages to capture much of the magic that made Castlevania and the Contra titles so special. It looks and sounds the part, and the gameplay is easy to pick up and hard to put down. Much of Konami's work at the time was simply porting assets and ideas from its other platforms to the Genesis, so for Rocket Knight to be a wholly unique and new experience was something to be excited about. It wasn't just some lame-ass mascot platformer like so many of the pretenders during the 16-bit era. This was a full-on action game that easily competed with the big boys. The media of the time even loved it, and it received nearly universal praise for its sight, sounds, and gameplay. Even the typically harsh Edge magazine managed to pull their heads out of their arse long enough to heap some praise onto it. It proved popular enough to get a direct sequel called Sparkster on the Genesis, and while it played well enough, I always considered it a major downgrade visually to the original. The Super Nintendo got a Sparkster of its own, but it was an entirely new spin-off that had nothing to do with the Genesis releases. It wasn't bad itself, but again, it still lacked the overall magic of the first. Konami resurrected the IP in 2010, a sequel to the Genesis storylines that brought Sparkster into a fully polygonal 2.5D action title simply called Rocket Knight. It played well but didn't sell enough to justify any future installments. This kinda leaves old Rocket Knight adventures here on the back burner of retro gaming. While many don't know just how good this game actually was, I still consider it a must for anyone who enjoys Konami-style action. It's very different from the other cutesy mascot-driven drivel that dominated the 16-bit landscape, and given a chance, you might appreciate it as much as I do. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.